Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to be doing a build and review of the 1/72nd scale PST KV-2, which I've previously done an in-box review of. I'll also be adding a 3D printed resin interior, which I designed and printed myself, and will be selling on my Cults page, a link to which I'll leave in the description of this video. But without further ado, let's have a build of everyone's favourite Soviet bunker buster. I began this build by giving all of the sprues and resin parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oils or particles that could prevent glue and paint from adhering to them. I then began to assemble the lower hull, cutting out the side plates and the hull floor. I used some sandpaper to remove the burring from the sprue attachment points and any flashing. I brushed away any fine plastic particles, and then I cleaned up the rear armor plate using a knife and file before gluing the left side to the floor piece using my preferred cement of Revell Contactor Professional. The rear plate was then glued to the hull floor and left side before I then added the right side on. Next, I cut out all of the parts for the turret and the gun. All of these parts had quite a lot of flash, which I had to clean up carefully using a knife and some sandpaper. Once cleaned up, I then glued the mantlet to the moving part of the cannon base, and once the turret sides were cleaned up, I put it in without any glue in the middle and glued the opposite side of the turret on. The fit for the turret was okay, although there was a rather nasty seam between the middle half of the turret, which later on I would unfortunately forget to clean up. Next, I positioned the rear door onto the rear armor plate and used it as a reference to cut the door section out of the rear plate so that I could open the rear of the turret. This plate was then glued to the turret and the door slotted on but not glued so that I could open and close it for stop motion purposes. I then cut out all of the resin suspension parts, radiator, driver and bow gunner's floor and the engine bulkhead. Once cut out, I started to glue these resin parts to the interior of the whole floor. I test fitted the roof a few times to make sure the parts would fit into the model, and I did have to trim down the engine bulkhead slightly, but otherwise the parts fitted just fine. Next, I removed the howitzer breech details and glued them to the inside of the moving mantlet part, followed by some of the internal structure details which were added to the corners of the turret and the stowage area for all of the shells. I designed the breech so that the breech block door could be opened or closed, and I probably should have glued it in place, but I wanted to leave it so that I could either have it open or closed for animations, and later on would subsequently damage it when dropping it, so I'll have to replace it at a later date. I cut out the resin vision slits, machine gun ammo, stowage boxes, the framework, seats, and the turret motors before gluing them into place inside of the turret. For gluing resin, I like to use Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue since it dries strong and clear with a tiny bit of flexibility as it cures. The final details to be added are the commander's various electronic boxes and controls before I cut out all of the shells which have all the propellant charges and position them based on War Thunder's KV-1. With most of the parts added to the inside of the turret, I returned to the lower hull, adding a shelf of propellant, spare machine gun ammunition, a few electrical parts, and the radiators. I then cut out and assembled the engine, including its radiator, air filters, drive shaft, and transmission. Returning then to the plastic parts, I cut out the turret roof, and after cleaning it up and doing a test fit, I glued the resin vision blocks to the inside of the roof, lined up with the various sights. The cannon and part of the mantlet was then cut out, and then I added the various details to the upper hull piece, including the rather fragile armor joint at the front, which I managed to break, the driver's visor, and the various parts that go around the bow machine gun. On the lower hulls, I added the 4 towing mounts, and on the turret I added the plastic weld parts to the front of the mantlet. I'd initially use the plastic machine gun barrels, but later on I would use some resin ones. The mud scrapers are one of the only pieces that needed to be glued to the lower hull, and they had a rather nasty seam line, but I would be weathering it quite heavily, so I decided not to spend too much time trying to clean it up. To see the engine details, I decided to also cut out the engine hatch using a scriber and a knife, and then sanded the edges so they were a little smoother. The plastic was rather thick, unfortunately, and it took quite a lot of effort to cut through, and the cut is probably not the cleanest. I really should have sanded the plastic down on the inside of the roof to make it a little bit thinner, but it would do. I then did a fair bit of cleanup for the ring piece, which then gets glued to the turret ring on the upper hull, and although the plastic on the inside of the hull was rather thick, fortunately the side skirts that are moulded to it were nice and thin, so I ended up using some tweezers to bend them up a little bit and make them appear dented and beaten up based on reference photos. The kit lacks a lot of surface detail, including weld seam lines and an armor texture, so for some of the larger spots I experimented with using a knife to add some of the weld marks in. Another experiment I tried was creating an armored texture by applying some Tamiya extra thin, and then I used an old brush to dab at the plastic once it was softened to give it a rough texture. This is probably a little bit exaggerated in 1/72nd scale, but I think it adds some nice detail to the surfaces and adds to the typical Russian tank character of being hastily built to a very basic and rough standard. Once the armoured texture is dry, I then add some of the absent weld lines by using a very fine amount of putty on a cocktail stick to draw some of the weld lines. As I go, I remove the excess putty using a damp piece of paper towel, and I used my cocktail stick to also add some marks on all of the weld lines. I should have also used this putty to fill the gap between the turret halves, but unfortunately I kind of forgot to do this, and since I'd already done the armor texture, I decided to just leave it. The kit had some stowage boxes, so I decided to cut some of them out and would glue them to the sides of the hull. The kit does include hoops for the towing cables, but it expects you to make the actual cable out of wire or something like that. I did consider doing this, but decided it would be a bit beyond my skills and end up being a little bit too fragile, so I decided to leave it for now, and maybe in the future I'll 3D print some towing cables at a later date. A few smaller accessories were added, such as the lights, antenna base, and mounting points for the tow cable on the sides of the hull, before I experimented with replacing the kit's included plastic handles on the turret side and roof by using some thin metal wire. I drilled out a small hole with a needle, and then glued the metal parts into place. I probably should have drilled the holes a lot deeper, and then measured the handle size rather than guessing and having to trim the wires as I cut them out to size, and ultimately this was so fiddly and fragile and the result was not really as good as I'd liked. I kinda wish I'd stuck with the plastic ones. Moving on, I used the needle to make a hole and then carved it out deeper using a knife and a rounded panel scribing tool to create the hole for the howitzer barrel, and with that the model was ready for painting. I'm sure many of you will be glad to hear that I tried out priming this model using some of Vallejo's white aerosol primer to add 2 light coats on both the inside and outside parts of the model. I personally don't think it's vital to prime if you've cleaned the plastic well enough, but I was keen to see if it would improve the paint adhesion, and on top of that I find it really helps for priming 3D printed parts, and it also would help uniform the surface since for some weird reason PST used various colours of plastic for the same kit. For the interior, the primer basically acted as my base colour, so I only ended up having to do a single coat of Vallejo model colour flat white, just to fill in any gaps where the primer was a bit light. I used a fine brush to then paint all of the seats with Vallejo model colour chocolate brown, followed by some Tamiya X32 Titan Gold for all of the propellant casings, as well as for parts of the turret elevation system, which I believed would have used an electronic motor. XF16 flat aluminium was then applied in several coats on the entire engine subassembly and on the radiators, while a second coat of chocolate brown and X32 Titan Gold were applied where they'd been previously. Vallejo model colour flat black was carefully painted on the radios, driver's gauges, vision blocks, commander's controls, and the gun sight using a very fine brush. Vallejo Russian Uniform Green was used to paint the stowage boxes on the inside of the turret, the inside of the breech, all of the hatches, and for some of the air filter systems attached to the engine. Tamiya XF18 Medium Blue was used to paint the air canisters and some of the engine piping. I believe these air canisters were primarily for shooting a bit of air through the engine to help it start in cold weather. I printed out 5 separate shells and painted them, plus all of the ones that are inside the stowage areas using some Vallejo Model Air Medium Sea Grey. Vallejo Model Colour Oily Steel was then used to paint the breech block. For the recessed glazed parts of the vision blocks, I used a very fine amount of Vallejo Model Air RLM1 Silver, and then I gave a few touch-ups with flat white where I'd made any mistakes. The engine's finer details received some flat black, along with X32 for the exhausts, and finally XF9 Hull Red was painted onto the cylinder head covers. After I'd done a few more small touch-ups, the interior was pretty much painted, so I moved on to painting the exterior. I used Russian Uniform Green mixed with some water to help thin it down, and then painted the turret first. This was followed by the upper hull, and then the tank's wheels and sprockets were painted while they were on the sprue. Using the primer as a base definitely seemed to help the paint adhere better, and made these strange multicoloured plastic parts of this kit and putty weld details blend into a nice uniform surface before adding the paint. I applied a second coat of paint on the turret, and an initial coat on the lower hull, since I could now hold onto it using the dry upper hull. I probably applied the paint a little bit too quickly and caused a few bubbles to appear, but by keeping the paint thin, I was still able to preserve my added surface details and prevent any brush strokes. In the end, I applied a total of 5 coats until I had a nice solid colour on the turret hull and the running gear. The particular tank I was doing wasn't going to need any decals for markings, so I skipped adding a gloss varnish after the 5th coat had dried, and instead applied 2 coats of Vallejo water-based matte varnish, diluting it with a bit of water, and then spreading it onto the model using a brush. The varnish gives the paint a protective layer from weathering, and helps to reduce the chances of scratching the paint off the model, especially when I handle it in animations. Normally I have no troubles using this varnish with a brush, even if it is not as smooth or clean as using an airbrush. However, I seem to consistently have issues with the Vallejo Russian Uniform Green mixing with this varnish, causing these strange lighter patches to appear, which I would have to fix later on. In the meantime, however, I gave the varnish 12 hours to cure, before then using an old brush to dry brush some XF16 flat aluminium onto the model to create some metal chipping. I focused on the hard or raised edges of the tank, as well as engine and crew hatches, parts of the suspension, the handles, and a little bit on all of the wheels and sprockets. I also added some random blotches where the crew would walk on the roof, and where stuff may scratch the massive sides of the turret. Once the chipping has dried, I then softened the effect by applying a thin layer of the uniform green around the edges of the chipping. As well as reducing how much metal is exposed and giving the effect a more subtle and realistic appearance, you can also create a layered and distressed effect, making it look like the paint has worn around the edges before being fully chipped away, which is a bit more realistic. At this stage, I also painted over the strange green effect, which seemed to occur from the varnish. Once the chipping is toned down, I then apply some flat aluminium on the sides of the road wheels, since these would be bare metal from scratching against the metal tracks. Next, I got out some Tamiya black panel scent and applied it over the entirety of the hull, the turret, and all of the road wheels. This enamel-based wash will flow into all of the recessed details, helping to highlight them and give them a grungy, dirty appearance. As you can see, the wash makes the whole tank a lot darker, so to reduce this effect on the raised areas and create a subtle post-shading effect, I use a cotton bud or a brush dipped in enamel thinners to then rub away the excess panel liner. This not only removes it from the raised areas, making the tank overall lighter, it also helps the wash to flow more into just the gaps. Just make sure if you're using this to use acrylic paints and let any varnish fully cure so that the enamel thinner won't react with the paint job. Although the kit included some very nice plastic tracks, I decided to make life a bit easier and instead reuse some 3D printed tracks I'd used for the SE KV-1 I built. These were painted with Vallejo Model Colour Oily Steel in 2 coats, and after the second coat was dry, I applied a thick coat of black panel scent to highlight the details. Before adding the running gear and tracks, I like to build up some layers of mud and dirt on the lower hull, using a cocktail stick to apply some of Vallejo mud and grass effects, which I also apply onto the tracks. I experimented with also adding some Vallejo thick mud effects on the lower hull to build up the effect and add a little bit of variety before adding a second layer of the mud and grass. In the future, I'd love to try out some of Vallejo's other weathering effects and aim for some other more subtle effects, as well as just the utterly caked in mud effect that I was going for here. Once the mud and grass effects have been applied, I then glue the inside half for the road wheels, idler and return rollers on both sides of the tank, before cutting out and gluing the sprocket and removing the extra teeth on it so that my resin tracks can be added on. Unfortunately, it seems the SE KV-1 must be ever so slightly shorter, as my tracks were a bit too short and required a fair bit of pressure to fit them into place, and they slightly moved the sprocket and return rollers especially. Once I'd wrestled the tracks into place, I then glued the second row of wheels to both the inner wheels and the track itself, using both Revell Contactor Professional for the plastic parts and Rocket Odorless CA glue for the resin. Aside from the aforementioned sprocket and return rollers, the outer wheel hubs went on alright, and though not perfect, it was easy and I was happy enough with the results, but if I ever do another PST KV-1 or KV-2, I will definitely double check the track size and make it a bit larger. The exhausts were then painted while on the sprue with a base coat of Tamiya X32 Titan Gold, using some X20A thinners to thin the Tamiya paints. And while that dried, I got out some Tamiya Weathering Master powders and used some water to activate the rust pigment and apply it over some of the chipped areas and hatch access handles to create some rust marks. I also used the rust pigment along with the sand and mud pigments to build up a layer of dirt on the tracks and mud guards in the various gaps, around the flat areas where the crew would walk, and also in a streaking motion down the sides of the turret and the hull. Once applied, I then used a wide brush dipped in some water to soften the streaks, along with a cotton bud to remove the excess pigment. I then created exhaust stains and some gun smoke on the barrel using the black pigment, which I built up in a few layers, and then used a damp cotton bud once again to soften the edges, and I repeated this process a few times until I was happy with the exhaust effect. The exhausts themselves were then glued into place and given a thick coat of rust pigment and black pigment to give them a worn out and dirty appearance. At this stage, the exterior was pretty much completed, so I returned to the interior. I got out the 3 machine guns I'd printed and cut them at the barrel, and then glued the rear part of the machine gun to both the bow, mantlet, and rear parts of the turret. The resin barrels were then used to replace the plastic ones for the exterior. I'd also printed out some fire extinguishers, which I glued to the rear of the turret and painted with Vallejo Vermilion Red. The shells that I'd printed received another coat of medium sea grey, and I painted the machine guns a base of Vallejo Flat Black, followed by the pouch with some shell casings using US Field Drab, and the button grips with chocolate brown. After a few more touch-ups, I placed the spare shells into their stowage bins, and got out some XF16 flat aluminium and dry brushed this around the interior to create some metal chipping from the crew and various parts inside of the tank. I painted the resin gun barrels using Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic, and to add some weathering to the interior, I first of all used rust pigment on the exhausts, mud and sand coloured pigments to add a build-up of dirt throughout the fighting compartment, and finally some black to add some oil and engine grime to the transmission and the inside of the engine bay. Finally, I got out some Tamiya black panel scent to once again highlight the interior details and add a dirty grimy appearance, and once the excess had been removed using some enamel thinners using a fine brush, my build of the PST KV-2 in 1/72 scale was finally completed. And here you can see the finished tank, and I've got to say I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. While this PST KV-2 isn't a perfect kit, especially for a relatively modern tooling, it still has its charms. The detail is on the simpler side, there's no surface texturing, and unfortunately there is quite a bit of flash and some minor imperfections throughout. The suspension being moulded directly to the hull may also sacrifice some realism, but in my opinion it makes the whole thing much sturdier, and a lot of that area ends up getting hidden anyways, like I've done with my weathering. My resin tracks were definitely too tight of a fit, being just slightly too short for the length of the hull. This seems to suggest that the PST hull might be a bit larger than the KV-1 that it was originally designed for. As for the paintwork, I'm not entirely sure why the varnish reacts so badly with the Russian uniform green. It's something I've only experienced using this colour, although now that I have an airbrush, I'm curious to see if spraying this varnish will fix the issue, so I'll be testing that in future builds. I also made a few compromises to allow the engine and rear access hatches to be accessible, which suits my filming and display needs, but if you wanted to have these hatches permanently open, I'm sure you could do a much cleaner job than I did. Overall, despite this kit having limitations and definitely not being the best KV-2 in 1/72nd scale, I feel that with a few simple low-cost tricks I managed to lift its appearance. It still captures the essence of the KV-2, and I'm really happy with how my interior turned out, and I hope some of you will also give it a go. And hey, for a bit of fun experimenting, mucking about, a little bit of 3D printing and design work, and 15 AUD, I would say this kit was definitely worth it. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as it really helps out. And if you've got any questions or obviously some nice feedback or suggestions for how I can improve, please leave it down in the comment section below. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products that I use when I make them. If you want to help support my channel that extra bit, then I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description as well. Tanker and Aviator tier members get a slight discount in my cult shop when buying my resin designs, and I'm also planning to do in the next couple months some regular-ish behind the scenes videos and outtakes as well for the upper tier members. I apologise for this video being a week late. I'd sort of been a bit busy with some life stuff, plus I've also just gotten an airbrush and I've been learning how to use that. I've also been working on 3D printing a few figures for some upcoming stop motions to give them a little bit more character, so once that's sort of sorted I should have a few animations on the way, and of course I'm still working on my big Milne Bay film script and working on the model kits for that. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and of course until the next video, as always, take care and model on.